I know the question on all of our minds this morning is, could you have a better head coach than Josh Heupel? I mean, this season, as a lifelong Tennessee football fan, this season has been hard to watch because although we have one of the best records in wins and losses that I've ever witnessed, there's nothing pretty about the way we're winning football games. And it's just amazing to me that Josh Heupel has created this culture of winning in Knoxville that he has created. If you're a football fan, you remember like me when he got here. Our football program was a mess. If you're not a football fan, what you need to know is we had a horrific losing season. We had a coach who was fired and disgraced for committing rules infractions. We had about 30 players leave the team and transfer to other schools. And Josh Heupel was hired, really, I think most people thought as an afterthought because we couldn't hire anybody better. And he has had nothing but amazing success. From the moment he stepped on campus, everything changed. If you see this next image of him, or this first image of him, that's the Josh Heupel we know and love, right? Smoking a victory cigar after beating Alabama for the second time in 3 years after we went, 15 years without winning? I mean, it was, and all of a sudden it seems like, we're supposed to beat Alabama. All of a sudden our whole mindset has changed. We're this year dancing with being one of the 12-team playoff field. And so it might be easy to forget that there was a time when nobody would have ever imagined that Josh Heupel could coach a football team. All we see is the success. All we see is the glory. But I want us to remember a few things about this guy that now seems to be so successful, so talented, so smart, so able to inspire young men to go out and play above their heads. This next image is a picture of Josh when he was 4 years old. He's in front of a locker set that his mom got him for Christmas when he was 4, and it's painted in the colors of the Miami Vikings. And it's got Tommy Kramer and Ahmad Rashad's name painted on it because those are two of his favorite players. Do you know, how many people here know where Josh Heupel grew up? Yeah, that's what I thought. Josh Heupel grew up in Aberdeen, South Dakota. I dare say most of us, even with a map, would struggle for a minute to find where Aberdeen, South Dakota was. It was a little no place of a town. And he grew up in obscurity, kind of a nobody. But he was good at sports. This next image is an article from his football days in high school. He played for the Central High School Golden Eagles. Central High School Golden Eagles in Aberdeen. And he led them to their first winning season in 10 years. This next image is, I actually found a picture of him playing football when he was in high school. This next image. Oh, nope, not that one. Do we have the one where he's in the green? There we go. That's him playing football when he's in high school. And although he was pretty phenomenal, what he found that he was interested in playing football in college, but nobody was really interested in him. He was just, as he put it, he said, I was this left-handed kid from nowhere. And there were a few schools that he kind of talked to, but they all saw him as being a second or third option at quarterback, and he really didn't get any offers. So he ended up going to a school called Weber State. See, we know of Josh Heupel as the Oklahoma University quarterback who won a national championship and was second runner-up in the Heisman Trophy. But that's not where he started. He started at Weber State. And do you know how small the football program at Weber State is? I couldn't find a picture on Google to show you about what the football program at Weber State looks like. Not one of a quality enough image. So I got the next one. He went to Weber and didn't succeed. So he then went to, I know you'll all recognize this university, Snow College. Snow College. Do we have any Snow College football fans here? This is their stadium. A little different than Neyland Stadium, right? I mean, my high school stadium is bigger than that. I didn't even notice it till later, but look at the very bottom. That's where the visitors sit. Do you see that? It looks like a parking space. That's the visitor section. That's where Josh Heupel played college football before Oklahoma. And only after he was successful there was he able to transfer to Oklahoma and play and have such success as a player. So then you'd think, well, okay, he was a great college football player at Oklahoma. He'd crossed the threshold. He'd made it. He could be a great football player in the NFL. No, he failed in the NFL. He never really made a roster. He got drafted and he was on a roster for a little bit, but he got hurt and he never really gets on any playing time, and he never really played in the NFL. No success there. And so you think, well, then he could be a successful coach. And he goes back to Oklahoma. And he is on the coaching staff for a while, but he gets fired. He gets fired. His own alma mater, where he won a national championship, where he was a second runner-up in the Heisman voting, they fired him because they didn't think he was a good enough coach. And he ends up, this next image, an offensive coordinator at Utah State. So how does somebody who grows up a nobody in nowhere and goes and plays college at Snow College and gets fired from his first head coaching job, how does he end up as the cigar-smoking, Alabama-beating college football coach that we love to call Coach Hype? I want you to think about where people who succeed come from as we look at our passage today. Will you stand with me out of reverence for the reading of God's holy word? Our passage today comes out of 1 Kings chapter 17, beginning at verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to him, Elijah, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you." So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, "Bring me a little water in a vessel, that I may drink." And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, "Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." And she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar, and a little oil in a jug." Jar and jug, Ronnie. "And now I am gathering a couple of sticks, that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." And Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterward make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth." And she went and did as Elijah said, and she and he and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. This is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. So we need to put this passage into a little bit of context. Elijah, you've probably heard the name Elijah before. Elijah is one of the most famous people in the whole Bible. How famous is Elijah? Well, Elijah, although he's only spoken of in a few chapters here in 1st and 2nd Kings, he's not spoken of a lot as far as his life. But Jesus said that Elijah who John the Baptist basically was, a second coming of Elijah, was the greatest person who'd ever lived on earth. At the Mount of Transfiguration, who was with Jesus? Moses and Elijah. Jesus refers to this miracle in his teaching. Elijah is a big deal in the history of our Christian Judeo faith. But where does he come from? See, we start this very chapter, chapter 17, at verse 1, and it just says Elijah shows up. We know nothing about Elijah except from where he comes from. We're given the name of a city, and archaeologists and historians and Bible scholars today say we don't even know where that is. It was such a little place. We can't even tell you that it existed historically because we can't find it anywhere. That's how small a town that Elijah comes from, like Aberdeen, South Dakota. And when he comes, we don't have any reason to understand that he's a person of any particular talent or skills. We don't have any reason to believe that he's a person of any particular righteousness or holiness. We are not told anything about Elijah. All we are told is that Elijah is told by God to go to the king at the time, King Ahab, and to tell him, King, there's not going to be any rain until God says there's going to be rain. There's going to be a drought. And he goes and he does that. And now we might think, the way that we think of the world, that when Elijah goes to the king and says, Elijah, you've been disobedient before God, you're leading the people of Israel in a way that's disobedient before God, and God is going to bring a drought on the earth, and King Ahab is going to say, thank you, Elijah, for bringing me that good news. I can repent. We can change our ways. You are going to be the head of our court. We're going to install you at the temple. You might imagine all sorts of ways that the king would respond to that. But apparently Ahab didn't take it very well. And Elijah, who you might think would say, hey God, you told me to go tell King Ahab this, and I did. Well, he's not happy about it. Will you back me up on this, God? Will you take care of this king? Will you protect me against him? And you might think God would say, sure, I'll strike him down with a thunderbolt. But here's what God says to Elijah, run and hide. Run and hide. Is that what we really think God usually says to us when we're trying to do what God has told us to do and we're trying to be obedient? Do we think that God's going to say, oh, okay, now run and hide? And he tells him to go and hide by this brook, and he said, the rain's going to stop and the drought's going to come, but this brook will give you water, and I will send ravens to bring you food. So at least Elijah has this assurance that while he goes to this brook and he hides, that God is going to take care of him. And the ravens come and bring him food, and the water from the brook gives him water, and you think, okay, he's going to stay there until maybe the drought is over, or until God says, let's go beat up on King Ahab. You think that there's going to be a happy ending to the story, but what happens? The brook dries up. And see, I'm thinking, if I'm Elijah, and I've gone, I did what God told me to do, and instead of standing behind me, God says, okay, now go run and hide. And I go run and hide, and at least, God's given me some water out of this brook, so I'm gonna be okay. And then the brook dries up. I'm thinking, I'm probably by about now, I'm beginning to think, I don't know that I'm hearing God very well. I don't know that I can trust God. I don't know that God has got my best interests at heart. And God says, get up and go to Phoenicia, basically, to go to this foreign land, and there's going to be a widow there that's going to feed you. And he does it. He does it. He gets up and he goes and he comes to this widow. He sees this widow And he has the interaction that we read about today. He says to the widow, "Hey, I'm here. God sent me here for my water and my bread." And she says, I don't have any. I don't have enough. All I've got is enough for me and my son to have one last meal, and then we're just going to lay down and die. I can't imagine how pitiful that is. I mean, can you imagine being at the point where you're telling somebody, I've only got enough food for me and my son to have one last meal, and then we're just going to lay down and die? And Elijah might have said at that point, well, I can't eat your last bread, right? I mean, wouldn't that have crossed our mind if we were Elijah? We would have to stop and think, can I really ask this widow to give me her last bread and water? See, Elijah has this crucial choice to make right here. Right here. Do I believe that what God has said to me is true? Because I'm telling you, as I read this story, you might read it, it might be easy for us to think, Elijah, he's the great prophet that fought 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and God called down fire on the altar to prove that God was real and Baal was not. I mean, that's the image we have of Elijah sometimes in our head. He's this great warrior prophet that's able to call in the power of God in amazing and crazy ways, and to prove to everybody that he's right. But here, he's not there yet. All he has seen so far is failure. All he has seen so far is that he has done what God told him to do, and it has not worked out very well. All he would have in his mind right now, if I'm Elijah and I'm going through what he's going, I think all I'm going to have in my mind right now is doubt. Everything you've told me to do, God, seems like it's been a mistake. And now I've got this widow and her son, and they're about to die, and you want me to ask her for her last bit of food? And so Elijah has a choice. I've got to decide whether or not I will believe in what God has told me, or I've got to decide that my circumstances are such that I cannot believe anymore. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been there? Have you ever been to a place and you feel like, God, I've done everything you've told me to do. I'm following all the instructions. I feel like I'm doing the right thing. And then it just feels like the wheels are falling off. And you've got to stop and look in the mirror and you've got to say, do I really believe that what God has told me is true? Or do I believe that because my circumstances seem so overwhelming that I just need to give up? That I need to give up on the promises of God? That I need to give up hope? That I need to give up and surrender to the world and say, you win? This miracle is followed up by a pretty neat miracle. He does ask the widow for the food, and he does it with boldness because he makes the choice, I'm going to believe in what God has told me. And that's when the jug and the jar never become empty. He follows in spite of the circumstances. He follows in spite of what looks like an impossible situation. He follows in spite of the fact that it seems completely irrational to do what God has asked him to do. But he does it. And the food flows. And miraculously, the jug and the jar are never empty. But the widow's son dies. And this is a really interesting point of the story. The widow's son died, and both the widow and Elijah attribute the death to God. The widow says, you know, Elijah, I'm upset with you. I curse you because you came here and your presence has revealed my sin to God, and out of response to my sin, God has killed my son. And Elijah says to God, God, why have you done this? Why this woman who's helped me, why are you taking her son? But the woman, her response is, this is finished. Death is the end of the story. There is no more hope. God has acted, life is taken, and there's nothing for me now but despair. Elijah thinks that God has not spoken his last word. Elijah knows that God isn't a God of death. God's not the God of death. God is the God of life. And so Elijah lays on this boy and prays and prays and prays. And he comes back to life. It's hard for us to have confidence that God is a God of life when we're surrounded by what feels like death. There's a great story. Some of you may not know this about me, but I like to read books. And any time that I meet with somebody that I respect a lot, that I think lives a really spiritual walk with God, and they say, you know, I read this book once and it was really influential to me. Guess where I am as soon as I get back to my computer? I'm on Amazon finding the book, and I've got a stack of them. Elizabeth will be my witness that I'm going to read someday. But recently, one that I did manage to read is by Watchman Nee. I had never heard of Watchman Nee, but he's written some amazing books, and they're short, which is really good too. Watchman Nee was a Chinese missionary. He founded churches in China before the communist regime, and then after the communist regime, he's thrown in prison. He spends his last 20 years in prison and dies there. But his words and his books bring so much hope and truth and light to people who today read about it, even though he had to suffer tremendously to produce that fruit. And one of the stories he told, and I'll be quick because I know our time is short, but he tells a story that I feel like I have to tell because it's so related to Elijah. He and some missionaries took a special trip to an island off the coast of China to preach for a couple weeks and to preach the gospel. And as they were preaching, they were getting no response, no converts. Nobody would have anything to do with Jesus Christ. They were making no headway. And finally, one of the people in one of the groups looked at the people and said, why won't you believe? What is keeping you from believing in God? And they said, well, we already have a God. We have a God that we believe. Tawang is this God that makes it, controls the weather, just like Baal controlled the weather in the eyes of the Canaanites. Tawang, and they asked him, well, how do you know that Tawang is God? And they said, well, for 286 years, we have had a festival every year. And it is divinely told to our religious leaders by Tawang on what day to hold the festival. And it has never rained on that day in 286 years. It has never rained on the day of the festival for 286 years. So we believe that Tawang is the God that controls the rain, and we believe in Tawang. And which one of the people... One of the missionaries very spontaneously blurts out, well, by golly, it's going to rain this year. It's going to rain this year. When's your festival? And the festival was coming in 2 days. In 2 days. And so the missionaries quit their preaching and they gathered together to pray. And the first thing they prayed is, oh, Lord, what have we done? Were we supposed to have said this? Were we supposed to have challenged this? Because what happens if we've spoken before God has told us to speak? Is the word we spoke from God, or is it just a prideful word from man? And Watchman Nee said, I heard this whisper from God. And it touched me because I imagine his fear of what have I done, and he hears this whisper from God, where is the God of Elijah? And watchman, he said, I felt this sudden peace. I felt this sudden peace that the God of Elijah, the God that can make it rain after 3.5 years, the God that controls all the universe is in control, and he's in control of the situation, and we have said exactly what God wanted us to say, and by golly, God is going to make it rain for the first time in 286 years on the date that this festival is established. And they prayed for rain. And they prayed for rain, and it was sunny and beautiful. And they prayed for rain, and it was sunny and beautiful. And for these 2 days, they didn't see a cloud in the sky. And they got up on the morning of the festival, and they looked out the window thinking there's going to be storm clouds. It's just going to get ready to burst out and rain, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. And they went back to praying. And just before the festival was supposed to start, it came a downpour. It came a gully-washing downpour, and the villagers were trying to carry out their stuff into the streets to start the procession, and they were falling in the mud, and their statues and their floats and things were broken. But they refused to believe. Imagine that people could be that stubborn. They refused to believe that God was involved, and so they said, well, we must have gotten the divination wrong. It must have been meant for us to have the festival on a different day. It's our fault. It's not our God's fault. It's our fault. And now we've decided again that he's called it for 2 days from now. Well, it didn't rain the next day. It was pretty and clear. But guess what? The day they recalled the festival, down the rain came. See, we've got a choice to make. We've got a choice to make in life. Do we believe in the God of Elijah? Do we believe that no matter how bad our circumstances are, do we believe that no matter how much we think we're doing what we're supposed to be doing and it all seems to be coming apart around us, do we have the faith to believe that no matter what, that God's in control and that God reigns and that everything is in his hands? And so we don't have to look at our circumstances. We don't have to look and see whether things are working out the way we want them to work out. We don't have to look and see if everything makes sense to us. We don't have to feel like we're victors over the world. We don't have to have any feelings. We just have to have faith. We have to have faith that the God of Elijah is still God, and we are in his hands. And every step you take, like little old Coach Josh Heupel, somebody asked one of his childhood friends, how in the world did this little scrawny kid from Aberdeen, South Dakota, get to be this hugely successful college football coach? Because they had interviewed this person, they talked through all the failures. They talked through all the times that Josh was tempted to give up because it didn't seem like it was going right. And they said 2 things. They said, one, I think that every experience Josh Heupel had as a little kid that was bad, because he had a tough time as a kid, every one of those experiences shaped him to be the person that he is, to not be a quitter. And number 2, I thought this was interesting. They said, I believe in my heart God always meant for Josh Heupel to be a football coach. If it's what God intends, we can walk toward it in faith and confidence and not fear what's going to happen. Let us be people who know that God is a God of life, not a God of death. That God is a God who calls us places that sometimes look scary or hard or difficult, but that God is always there with us, and that if we just are faithful to him, there is no more faithful person to us than the God that created the universe. Amen.